Hello and welcome to this video, and today I'm going to be looking at the life and work of the jazz giant John Coltrane. A few weeks ago I made a video on the four titans of music. They're the musicians that really influenced me more than any others, and that would be like Miles Davis, John McLaughlin, Frank Zappa, and last but not least John Coltrane. Now John Coltrane's influence on music and his influence on culture is so huge, really, in a way, that what I find is musicians tend to focus on a certain aspect of him and sort of ignore the other aspects of him. So for many musicians, John Coltrane's the guy that wrote Giant Steps and played through that very, very difficult chord change. Giant Steps has become like a test for musicians, and there's many musicians that appreciate him because of his skill at being able to play through those chord changes at that sort of speed and being a pioneer of that. For me, that really misses out on the reason why he was doing that, which we're going to try and get into this video. There's some musicians that really concentrate on a Love Supreme and the sort of classic quartet of the early 60s with Elvin Jones and Jim Garrison and McCoy Tyner. That sort of spiritual epoch of that classic quartet, they concentrate on that. And that often elevates him to a almost like spiritual figure. You know, there is a church of John Coltrane in America where he's almost like a saint. So there's that aspect of John Coltrane. There's the free jazz pioneer, the avant-garde musician, the musician that makes very difficult music like Ascension and Interstellar Space. There's that musician, and there's other ones too. There's the musician that played with Miles Davis, you know, that was on the biggest selling jazz album of all time, Kind of Blue, and contributed to that. So it's such a huge career and such a multifaceted career that what I thought I'd do was pick out my favourite albums. I'm not going to rank them, I'm just going to go through his career and pick out a bunch of albums that if you're new to John Coltrane and you want to sort of know which albums to go for, where to start, these would be good albums to go for. And I'm going to try and cover his whole career of, you know, which in a way is incredible for how short it was. John Coltrane was born in 1926. He emerges onto the scene in the late 40s, but he doesn't really make much of an impact. He's not like a Miles Davis, who was born exactly the same year. By 1946-47, Miles is playing with John Coltrane and he's a star. You know, he makes Birth of the Cool and he's a big jazz star. Well, Coltrane's in the background for a lot of the 40s. He's playing as sideman. I think he played with Tad Dameron and Dizzy Gillespie in the big bands. He's biding his time. This is the thing about Coltrane. You feel it's that thing where they call him train. His power is like a steam train, and it starts off slow and it gets going, and it's a force that's unstoppable. And you feel that you know, he's working as a sideman through the 50s, you know, with various people, and he's also played with a drug habit. He's a heroin addict, so I think that's holding him back as well. But he's pushing towards something. He plays with various bands. The stuff he did in 1957 with Thelonious Monk is well worth checking out. It's actually one of the great jazz albums of all time. And, you know, I think around about 55, he joins the Miles Davis group, and that starts to bring him to the fore, and you start to hear Coltrane's sound. And what is his sound? Well, it's like the antithesis of Miles Davis in a way. Coltrane is playing millions of ideas all the time. He's really exploring the areas that have been created by bebop, where you're playing over chord changes and you're playing on the upper intervals of those chord changes, and you're trying to escape the bounds of those chord changes using harmonic theory. And he's doing that by going deeper and further into modes and scales. So you get this sort of very intricate, highly detailed, cascading sound that starts to emerge in the 50s from John Coltrane. This starts to get really noticed. I think if you wanted an entry point for this period, I would go for this album here, Milestones by Miles Davis. This is an utterly fantastic album. There's a ton of fantastic albums by the Miles Davis Quintet, but this is amongst the best. The playing is absolutely incredible. It's got John Coltrane with Miles, obviously, and then it's got Cannibal Adderley on alto sax, who is equally incredible. And to hear those two saxophone players working together, so different, but yet working so closely and brilliantly together, and to contrast Cannibal Adderley's sort of post Charlie Parker soul jazz virtuoso saxophone playing against Coltrane's sort of, monolithic, cascading, detailed sheets of sound approach is that's really interesting. Red Garland on piano, the great Paul Chambers on bass, and the great great Red Garland, they're all incredible, and Philly Joe Jones on drums, one of the great jazz drummers. And this is a real virtuoso album. They're really pushing it out. There is a tune on beginning of side 2 called Miles, and it is different to the usual sort of post bebop chord change format. Miles spells the beginning of a sort of modal way of playing jazz. Now, modal is a different way of improvising, where rather than building your improvisations up on chord changes, you're building them up on modes. And what modes are aspects of scales. I don't think people quite understand this. So if you have a C major scale, for example, if you position the harmonic center around the second note of the C major scales, which would be a D, that would create a mode, a Dorian mode. It would be the D Dorian mode. And the Dorian mode is a minor mode, but it's not like the classical pure minor, where you would have, in that you would have a flat 6, which is a very flattened sound. The Dorian mode has a major 6, so it's a major sounding mode. And this idea of working things around modes, which really comes from, say, like you'd hear it in Indian music, and you hear it in certain folk forms, is a way, I think, that the musicians are trying to push at the limits of jazz. They're trying to free jazz, and this is a big thread, I think, that runs through John Coltrane's career, is he is pushing jazz to the limits. He's trying to burst the limits of jazz, and he's trying to free it in all sorts of different ways. And one of them is this modal way, the use of scales. And one of the things that Coltrane's going to do is he's not just going to stick to one scale, but he's going to have multiple scales working on top of each other. So we would have an idea here, but that idea then cascades out into lots of different scales and lots of different intervallic structures within scales. At this point, Coltrane's really pushing the bounds of harmony, and he's also really interested in keys or scales that are a major third apart. Now, if you take the cycle of fifths and you position the 3 keys that are a major third apart, what you get is like a triangle on the cycle of fifths. And there's tons of drawings at this time where Coltrane is really looking at almost the mystical aspects. So there's this other aspect of John as well, which is this spiritual awakening, enlightened aspect, the spiritualism. Now, the famous story is that he was a heroin addict, and he had a sort of almost like a religious conversion in 1957, and he at that point he stopped taking drugs, and that becomes later the sort of foundation for his album A Love Supreme. So I think the point is that here at this point he is pushing at the limits of jazz for spiritual reasons in 2 ways. One's a modal way, and one is through just bursting out the chord changes by using this triangulation of scales, which is really coming. It's almost like playing in all the keys at the same time. It's like you take a cadence that's in one key, and then you go to another cadence in another key, and then another cadence in another key. The triangular format where they're equally spaced across all the keys. There's some great videos on YouTube if you want to get deeper into that, but I'm trying to just describe the aesthetic idea of taking that harmonic system and just busting it open, of freeing yourself from it. And I think that's something that gets forgotten. With the Miles group, it's definitely going more towards modes. The follow-up album to Milestones is this absolute masterpiece, and I'm surprised I haven't covered this before on this channel, because it's one of the greatest jazz albums of all time. Miles Davis Kind of Blue, where they really deeply start to explore modes on here. A more trancey sort of static harmony. It also happens to be one of the greatest albums ever made, not just jazz albums, but any albums. So, if you want to just quickly get into Coltrane with Miles, those are the two I would go for. He starts his solo career up around this time. And if you want to start a place for his solo career, a good place would be, which I think this could be from 57, 58. I can't see the date here. But this is the earliest one I'm going to give you, which is Blue Train. Okay, on here, this is sort of round about the same time as Milestone's Kind of Blue, but on tracks, there's some great blues on here. Coltrane is a great blues player as well, it must be said, and Blue Train is a fantastic blues. There's a jazz standard, I'm Old Fashioned, and then there's a track called Moment's Notice, and on there you will hear the beginnings of what is become known as the Coltrane Matrix, which is then used on this follow-up album, Giant Steps, where you have obviously Giant Steps, which is this famous tune in jazz which utilises the Coltrane Matrix, which is playing in sort of three keys at once. And by this point, Coltrane is playing so fast through it. It's become a tester for musicians, but I think what a lot of musicians don't realise is the reason why John Coltrane's doing that is because he's trying to push the limits of harmony. He's trying to break harmony in a way. Break it open so you can express yourself and not be limited to the normal, chord, scale, mode way of soloing that had been in jazz all the way through. It's almost like the jazz version of the 12-tone system that comes from classical music. But this is also filled with some lovely blues and some lovely ballads. This is an absolute classic. Blue Train here, this is on the Blue Note label, and it's beautifully recorded. This one's on Atlantic, it's still beautifully recorded, but if you want a real audiophile album, that's the one. But these two here are really important starting points in Coltrane's career. They're essential purchases, I would say. Around about this time, he starts to coalesce around a certain group of musicians, including McCoy Tyner and Elvin Jones, and eventually Paul Chambers, and they form the classic Coltrane Quintet, which I would now see as the second phase of Coltrane's career. There's like sort of three phases. He makes this around about 1960, right? And the lineup here hasn't quite settled. He's still got Steve Davis on bass, but this is a change for me. There's a change that happens here, which really opens up the second phase of Coltrane's career. And what he does is on the track My Favourite Things, it is pretty long. I think it's about 15 minutes long. If we got a time, it opens up. Yeah, it's 13 minutes 41 seconds. They do a standard jazz thing where they play the head of My Favourite Things, but when it comes round back to the first chord, which I think is an E minor, it's like an E minor to F sharp minor, I think it's something like that. That's my doggy. When it gets to that point, he sort of freezes those two chords and it's just loops, and he starts to play modally over them, and it's like freezing the music at that point. It just opens out into that one harmonic part, and he starts to explore that E minor. It's like an E Dorian mode, and he starts to explore that incredibly deeply, much further than anyone did on even Kind of Blue or any of those Miles albums. And he starts to cascade these scales in, and I think the reason why he could do that is because he now got McCoy Tyner, and McCoy Tyner had a way of playing piano behind him. He would break the harmony down into fourths. It's quartal harmony, and fourths, of course, if you think of the cycle of fifths, if you go backwards, it's a cycle of fourths, and fourths are really sending you through every key. So they've almost found a different way, and of course what Coltrane's playing is the same stuff he's playing on Giant Steps. He's opening out keys in the same way using the Coltrane Matrix. He's still going on, but he's no longer relying on the chord change to do that. He's doing it within this tonal centre of this one chord. Now, how do you keep that going when the harmony is just static? Well, one way is to push at the extremes of the harmony, which is what Coltrane's doing, but it's also to push at the extremes of the rhythm. And we have the incredible Elvin Jones appearing for the first time here, and Elvin's got a way of playing where he's also he's playing polyrhythmically, he's bending time, and he seems to be in a number of times at the same time. And he's creating this almost like these buffeting waves, which a weaker player would just drown in. They just be pulled under. But when you've got players as strong as McCoy Tyner and John Coltrane, they seem to be elevated on top of this like a great surfer. This is an incredible album. His solo on My Favourite Things is a real changer for jazz, and that's another essential Coltrane album. We're now into the classic Coltrane quartets with the addition of Paul Chambers. Not Paul Chambers, Jimmy Garrison. And what Jimmy Garrison brings to it is he also changed the way the bass is working, because rather than just walking, what he's doing, he's strumming it, and it's a lot more rhythmical, and it's a lot driven, a lot of like chords on the bass. It's all about power. This quartet is all about power and energy, all linked to more and more a sort of spiritual quest. So I've pulled out some of my favourite albums by the classic quartet. The first is Coltrane live at the Village Vanguard. It's got Spiritual on there, first track, which I think he plays soprano sax on. He starts to bring the soprano in, which is much more higher and reedier, almost like an Arabic or Indian instrument. He's really tuning into Indian music at this point. Softly in the Morning Sunrise, he does a jazz standard, always incredible, player of melodies, Coltrane. But then you switch over onto side 2, and there's a track called Chasing the Train, which is a blues. It's hard to hear, but it's just a straight blues. But Coltrane doesn't approach it like just using like blues licks and pentatonic scales. He starts to open it up using the things we're saying, but he also starts to use just the upper register of the saxophone. He starts splitting notes into adding screaming and energy. And for me, Chasing the Train is the beginning of a very particular way that Coltrane plays free jazz. He's pushing at the limits of jazz all the time, and by the early 60s he's starting to push into free playing. Now it's worth saying that at the same time you've got a musician like Ornette Coleman who's come along, and he's created a freer form of jazz just by ignoring the rules. He's just gone, look, we've got a different way of doing this, Ornette Coleman has his own set of rules, but they're different to Coltrane. But I'm sure at this point Coltrane's hearing what Ornette Coleman's doing as well, and that must have challenged what John Coltrane was trying to do, because I think Coltrane was trying to arrive at it by taking the mechanism of jazz and using it in on itself to bust jazz open, which is a bit like pushing a huge rock up a mountain. And every peak that he reached, and I'm paraphrasing a quote from a famous jazz book, but every peak he reached, he must have found Ornette Coleman up there like a sort of court jester dancing around going, I'm doing the same thing, look at me, Ornette's approach to free jazz was to elevate the other elements as equal to the harmony and the chord progression and the melody. And to really, to my ears, look at phrasing and the logic of phrasing and say, well, I know the music logically wants to go there, but what I'm playing logically wants to go over there, so I'm going to follow that over there. And I think this starts to influence Coltrane as well. So yeah, we start to hear the beginnings of free jazz. And if you're troubled by free jazz and you want to explore it more, Chasing the Train is a good place to start. And once you locate the blues part of it, and you start thinking of the blues underneath it, maybe pick up a guitar piano and just play the blues chords and just hear how the band just stretch away from that, but still building upon it. It might give you an idea of how to tune into listening to free jazz. Another great album for me, there's so many great albums by the classic quartet. When I was a kid, I had a book, the Rolling Stones book of rock and roll, and it had John Coltrane in, and I used that to buy albums. And for most bands, you could open it up and it would give a 5-star album to the best albums. You go, well, that's the one to go for, I'll check that one out. When it got to the quartet albums in this book, of which there seem to be about 30 or 40 albums, every single one had a 5-star. And this is the problem. You can just go and buy one. They're all incredible. So I'm just pulling out the ones that I happen to have listened to and I love, you know. So this is all my personal opinion. So here's one that is absolutely incredible. Impressions by John Coltrane. It starts out with India. This has also got the great Eric Dolphy, another guy that's pushing at the limits. And Eric Dolphy is pushing at the limits of free jazz by really pushing this idea of intervals. He's not playing linear lines. He's jumping up and down and going on, very angular. I think all this is influencing Coltrane. But on India, you really hear the Indian influence in the music. And then I think there's a blues good up against the wall. And then on side 2, he does Impressions. It's 15 minutes long. And Impressions is basically a reworking of So What. It's just the 2 modes that So What is built upon. And here again we start to hear John Coltrane pushing the envelope. And one of the things you hear in Impressions that Coltrane starts to do is you'll hear the piano, the chords will strip away, and then eventually the bass strips away, and you're just left with drums and Coltrane sax, which is an incredible experience to go for. Right, we're now at my favourite Coltrane album of all time. Now, you'll probably think I'm about to stick this one up, and I'm not. This is my favourite Coltrane album. Coltrane Live at Birdland. So, if you want to buy one Coltrane album, and I'm going to stick my neck out even before you buy a Love Supreme, if you just want to buy one Coltrane album, get this one, and I'm going to tell you why. It's fantastically recorded, it's live, the musicians are really going for it, but it also has a couple of studio cuts on it, so you get the live and the studio thing all at the same time. Right, Afro Blue is a sort of Latin, Indian, African influence tune. Absolutely brilliant. He's playing soprano sax on that. Incredible if you want to hear the sort of things he did on, say, My Favourite Things, that type of approach. And then he does a jazz standard, I Want to Talk About You. You want to hear Coltrane play a jazz standard? Then he does that. But at the end of that, he plays a tenor sax cadenza. It's one of the most incredible solo instrumental passages in the history of all music. It's beyond belief what Coltrane does on that. And I listened to it over and over when I was a kid, and it became the defining sort of way of playing for me, you see. I discovered Coltrane when I was about 14, 15 years old. They had they showed the sort of, I think it's the 1959 black and white footage of the Miles Davis quartet, and I was blown away by it. I already knew Miles, and I thought I loved it, and it was great, and I was into my jazz, but I never heard John Coltrane before. And when they did So What, and Coltrane's solo started up, I had never heard any instrumentalist like that in my life. And it tuned my ear in. I think the reason why I got into people like Alan Holdsworth and John McGoughlin and all those musicians is because it had been lit up by the way Coltrane was playing. And he starts off really systematically, and he plays a couple of 3 notes, and then it adds the phrase As You Would, and then expands on that and expands on that, and then it seems to go up that way, and then exactly the same amount that downwards, then all the way up and down, and all the way down and up, and then up, down, up. And he just seemed to expand out the music like this to a level which is absolutely astonishing. And I think there's one point in that video where you can see the musicians are trying to be really cool, but he's hitting licks, and you can see them looking around going, what is this that this guy's doing? Well, if you want to hear that approach at just the highest level, the cadenza on I Want to Talk About You. And then we get the promise, and this is sort of classic Coltrane, Elvin Jones, you know, really expanding the bounds, very, very free, very beautiful playing. Then you get Alabama. Now, Alabama is like a condensed version of a Love Supreme. It's very moving. It hasn't got that spiritual underlying. It's actually about some poor black kids that got killed in where some white supremacists had burnt down a church. If my mind is right, I think that's what happened. Very moving piece of music, and to me is a spiritual tune, and it shows Coltrane's spiritual side. And then at the end there's a track called Your Lady, where it really just breaks down to sort of a drums and sax thing. So the reason I love this album so much is it's the one where Coltrane sort of does everything on here that he does. It's an absolutely fantastic album. Of course, that's followed up in 1964 by this. One of the greatest albums ever made, full stop. I've covered two of the greatest albums ever made in this video. Kind of Blue by Miles Davis and The Love Supreme by John Coltrane. Right, this is the album that really brings spirituality to the centre of music making. I think anyone who's done that since, especially people like John McGoffin, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, it's really been influenced by this album. It's just a perfect, incredible album, and it is one of my favourite Coltrane albums. The reason why I would say don't get this first, because it's not entirely representative of the whole of what Coltrane does. Coltrane plays jazz standards and he plays bossa novas and he plays like really free stuff. This is really exploring a certain spiritual aspect, but it is truly one of the great albums. What can I say about it? If you don't know it, go and listen to it right now because it's incredible. And this album is the one that breaks out. This is the album that everybody in the 60s is listening to. This is what Jimi Hendrix is listening to when he's trying to do Machine Gun. This is what the Byrds are listening to. I was in a pub once with Robert Plant, when I used to play Robert, and I can remember somebody brought up Coltrane and said, it's quite hard to listen to. And Coltrane is really hard to listen to. And Robert turned around and said, no, he said, Love Supreme is one of the greatest albums ever made. So I've never known anybody who's heard this album that doesn't think it's one of the greatest albums. So yeah, what are you doing if you haven't got a copy? Go and get one now, right? At this point, this sort of spiritual quest is pushing him further and further into free jazz. Now, this is where Coltrane starts to become pretty difficult to listen to. Now, I bought this album. I don't know whether this is still available under this name. It's a double album. I've got it called John Coltrane Live in Paris. And it's Coltrane, McCoy Tyner, Jimmy Garrison, Elvin Jones. It's recorded in 1965 at the Antibes Jazz Festival and then at the Sao Paulo Paris. There's an album you can get where they play a live version of A Love Supreme, and I think it's from the same gigs that these were recorded from. Why did I put this out? Because this is the classic quartet, but it's right at the end of their career, and this is where Coltrane is really pushing them towards free jazz on this album, and I absolutely love it. Around this time he starts to augment the band in the studio and later live with a second drummer, a different saxophone players. He would have two bass players. We'll get into all that in a minute. But on here you get to hear full out free jazz, avant-garde music, but played by the Coltrane Quartet, and played absolutely brilliantly. I used to listen to this album over and over again, partly out of just trying to work out what John Coltrane was doing, because at this point he's moving away from the sheets of sound and the scales to just pure screams, but this is an absolutely fantastic album. We're now into the free jazz area with Coltrane's playing. The album that you need to get the classic album would be Ascension, which was made in 1965. I have it on this. This is a great CD to get. The major works of John Coltrane. It's got Ascension on, but it's also got some of these more free albums of this period on Kula Samama and Selflessness. Now, on Kula Samama and Selflessness are not his great albums. They're very interesting albums. I think some of these albums were made, I think it could be On, which is made where he's dropping acid, if my memory serves me right. It's the middle of the 60s, and I think the record label perhaps are trying to market it as well as being sort of hippie trippy stuff. But Ascension, that is an absolute masterpiece, but a very difficult listen, right? So what we have is John Coltrane, McCoy Tyner, Jimmy Garrison, Elvin Jones, plus Archie Shepp and Pharaoh Saunders on tenor sax, John Takei and Marion Brown on alto saxophones, Freddie Hubbard and Dewey Johnson on trumpets, Art Davis on bass, right? So it's almost like two groups that are playing at the same time. It's two bass players, a billion saxophone players. It's organised actually quite tightly when you study it, with definite solos. It's not just free jazz and everyone's just going for it. They go through definite solos one by one. So, you know, Coltrane takes one solo, and then Ferris Saunders takes another. It's right at the extremes of music. It's a scream. He's trying to depict the idea of ascending to heaven over a 40-minute track. What's famous for it is that they did 2 versions of it, and then he okayed the one he wanted to release, but because no one was quite sure what the hell was going on, they released the wrong one, and then they released it again. On here you get both versions. You know, this is a difficult listen. Ascension isn't one of my favourite Coltrane albums. It's an ordeal that you go through, you know, and it's something else. It's difficult. For me, the masterpiece of his free period is this album, Meditations. This is utterly incredible. Full on free jazz. But this for me is like equal to A Love Supreme. It's another spiritual based album. And it starts off with Father, Son and the Holy Ghost, which is absolutely incredible. Coltrane's solo on there is just, it's like he's plugged into the source of all energy. It's absolutely incredible. It's basically the Coltrane quartet, but with Rashid Ali on drums. Rashid Ali is a fantastic drummer. That's, again, what you're hearing is the free guys are exploring how to play without referring to the usual rules of music and improvisation. Where someone like Elvin Jones is playing free because he's building on the building blocks of jazz improvisation, if that makes sense. And I think the tension between the two is sometimes a little difficult, you know, and I find that does confuse it a little bit. Sometimes I think, oh, I'd like just Elvin or Rashid Ali, you know, these two things. It starts to get a little bit like, you know, at some points this music could be described as somebody trying to kill a donkey in a shed while somebody in the background rummages through the junk in there trying to find something to kill that donkey with. It's pretty extreme music, but I do absolutely love this album. I love the free Coltrane, and what it is that it's the power of his saxophone playing and the way the musicians just follow him through. So if you wanted to get one free jazz album, I would get this one. But if you wanted, and this is the last album I'm going to look at, if you wanted a free jazz album, this is right at the end of his career, 1967, one that is more accessible, because I must admit Meditations isn't that accessible. Try this, Interstellar Space, which is just saxophone and drums. It's beautifully recorded, and I think it allows you that the space between those two and the lack of harmony. So you can just ignore harmony. It's just about Coltrane's the drive, the melodic harmonic drive of his saxophone, underpinned by these drums. One of the ways to approach free jazz is, rather than expect it to do what you want it to do, listen to the way they're actually avoiding doing what you want. You know, how do you play without referring to a certain key or tonal center or a certain tempo or certain rhythm? How do you explore that area of freedom? You know, how do you break out from the limits? Anybody who picks an instrument up and just starts fiddling around it will see that your fingers actually do naturally fall into scales and harmonies, you know, if you can play. So how do you get around that, and how do you maintain that? That's the key, I think, to looking at free jazz. And why would they want to do it? Because by doing this, it opens up new areas of music. You know, so many things, so many movements happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, right up to today. When I examine where the roots of that is, it's often in the free jazz and exploratory jazz of the 60s that was happening. Anyway, so that's been my take on John Coltrane. Utterly incredible musician. Absolutely amazing that this guy, who died in 1967 of liver cancer at the age of 41. I'm now 53, and it's incredible to think I'm 12 years older than Coltrane ever was. That's incredible. But yeah, in that short time, he completely changed the face of music. And I think what he is a touchstone for utter excellence, utter creativity, and utter decency, honesty, and a belief in the truth of your being, if that makes any sense. I think that's what John Coltrane represents to me. You know, there's not a lot of laughs. It's not Frank Zappa. You know, it's not sneery and streety like Miles Davis. Coltrane is something else, and I think it's a standard that all us musicians aspire to in some way. And I'm not just on about the virtuosity. Yes, he is a touchstone for virtuosity, without doubt. He's a touchstone for the idea of being true to your creative will. But it's even more than that with Coltrane. I think there was something about his personality that was very pure. Let's just put it like that. And that is a very interesting thing indeed, musically. So I hope that's given you, the people who have not really explored into John Coltrane, a sort of way in, and a couple of albums that you could go and have a listen to. Some of those might have sounded really interesting. You want to go and check them out. And for those of you who do, you train, hopefully my view on it was interesting at least, and you got to see the albums I'd like. So again, if you like these videos, please put a comment in, say what you think. If you've got any questions about it, I'll try and answer them if I can. And like the video, subscribe to the page, and I will see you soon with another video. Thank you very much.